Are we ready to go?
Ready whenever you are.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Greg Lee. I'm the treasurer of the Topeka Bar Association this year. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, who completed his undergraduate degree in English from Washburn in 2005 and his Juris Doctorate degree from Washburn School of Law, where I was pleased to teach in a group that taught pretrial advocacy that our speaker successfully completed. Our speaker took office as the district attorney on January 9th, 2017. Prior to being elected district attorney, he served in the Shawnee County DA's office as an assistant DA, where he prosecuted cases including juvenile and SINK cases, child exploitation and abuse, drug distribution, property offenses, violent offenses, sex offenses, and homicides. Please welcome our DA, Mike Kagi.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate that introduction, and I do want to credit most of my trial advocacy success to that class. So thank you again. I'm going to jump right into it. We have a lot of ground to cover in this CLE, and if anyone has questions, feel free to type them in the box. We can answer them as we go, or if you prefer, we can get through the material and then start to address them. And let me see if I can do this. Share screen bit and get us started here. Okay. All right. So the title, the title here is Murder and Methamphetamine. All right. A little bit about this program. We will consider the connection between methamphetamine addiction and violent behavior, the larger impact this has within the criminal justice system, and the role this played in the Grant Street triple homicide. I will tell you at the outset that we will include a discussion of graphic violence that is specific to the case, but we will not include any graphic photographs. However, there will be photographs showing some blood stains. I'm sensitive to the fact that this is over the noon hour, and I just want to place that warning as we begin. The Grant Street triple homicide did not start like most crimes or most homicides in terms of the investigation. Most violent crimes are reported to us beginning with a 911 call and officers being dispatched. This one, not so much. In this case, a man walks through the front doors of the law enforcement center on March 12, 2017, and informs officers that he had just witnessed a triple homicide. Not knowing if he was serious or not, he was taken to an interview room in order to give a statement. What followed was an outrageous story about kidnapping, beating, torture, and eventually killing, all committed without any discernible reason or motive. Law enforcement was not really sure how to take this, not sure how credible it was. However, shortly after this man told his story, a female walked into the law enforcement center and told a story of a triple homicide that matched several of the key details. The man had said that the crimes occurred the previous evening, but he could only say that they happened at a home in North Topeka. He didn't have an address. The female, however, said the crimes took place at her residence just across the river and a short drive from the law enforcement center. Officers were dispatched to the location. Here you see the exterior residence at 115 Northwest Grant. Everything seemed normal on the outside, but after making entry to do a welfare check, officers discovered a nightmare. The house itself was dirty and cluttered, but that's typical of meth houses that officers are used to walking into every single day. However, officers also immediately noticed bloodstains on the carpet. They also saw evidence of a prolonged struggle, and upon entering the basement, they located the bodies of 3 victims, just as had been described by the 2 individuals who were still sitting at this point at the law enforcement center. The victims were identified as Luke Davis, Matthew Levitt, and Nicole Fisher. Their bodies had been wrapped up and discarded in the basement of the house and left there. What ensued was a grueling investigation as law enforcement unraveled the stories of everyone involved. They spoke with the man at the law enforcement center again, and they were able to receive more information in a second interview. This is a photograph, a still shot of a video that depicts the Pontiac G6 belonging to Matthew Levitt. Matthew Levitt arrived with this man at Northwest Grant around 12:30 a.m. on March 12, 2017. They were there to actually pick up Nicole Fisher and to give her a ride home. But upon arrival, they were threatened at gunpoint and ordered to enter into the residence. After that occurred, someone in the house took this vehicle, Levitt's vehicle, and left the residence. And it was retrieved later in the Kansas River. Although the investigation revealed several individuals that were involved in committing these crimes, it quickly pointed to a prime suspect known as JoJo, aka Joseph Aaron Cron. JoJo was described by witnesses as a tall, slender, white male with dark hair and cowboy boots. Joseph Cron was located within hours at 1902 Northwest Winter and transported to the law enforcement center for questioning. Cron was issued his Miranda warning, but he agreed to waive those rights and speak with detectives. He admitted that he was at 115 Northwest Grant the previous night. Cron stated that he had been called over there to scare some people. When Cron arrived, Matthew Levitt and Nicole Fisher were already being held in the house at gunpoint against their will. As part of his scare tactic, Joseph Cron had brought a plastic sheet to line the room. You can see the sheet in the photograph. At this point in time, everyone was in the front room of the house, and there was an unexpected knock on the door. It was Luke Davis. He had arrived, and he was looking for a ride. Luke was forced inside the home, and he was held at gunpoint. Cron stated in his interview that everyone was bickering during this time and that he had enough. But he primarily focused his anger on Luke Davis, repeatedly telling him to shut up. While the victims were being held at gunpoint, someone left the house and went to Walmart. You can see the receipt here. Ponchos, bandanas, and 48 zip ties were purchased. Back at the residence on Northwest Grant, Cron continued to abuse Luke Davis. Ultimately, he became frustrated enough that he tied Luke Davis to an office chair in the living room using the zip ties that had just been purchased over at Walmart. After some time, Luke Davis broke his hands free of the restraints and made a break for the front door, trying to escape. These are the zip ties that were used. Joseph Cron tackled Luke at the door and he pulled out a knife that he carried on his belt. In the ensuing struggle, Luke Davis was stabbed. However, this did not kill him. Cron found an upright fan sitting next to the front door. You can see the fan depicted in the photograph. He used the electrical cord from the fan to strangle Luke Davis to death. After Davis was killed, Nicole Fisher was tied to the office chair with her hands behind her back. Joseph Cron used a black trash bag to suffocate her to death. After Nicole was killed, Matthew Levitt was placed in the office chair and beaten by Joseph Cron. Matthew was able to free himself from the chair, but then he fell to the floor. Cron placed Matthew Levitt's head in a scissor lock with his legs and strangled him to death. After Luke, Nicole, and Matthew had all been killed, their bodies were carried into the basement. Cron himself threw Nicole's body over his shoulder and carried her down the stairs. Covered completely in blood after having killed 3 people, Joseph Cron returned home to burn his clothes and knife in this burn barrel. During the interview at the law enforcement center, however, Cron was still wearing the cowboy boots. They were covered in blood. So, why did this happen? Well, we don't have a discernible motive other than people were bickering, and Cron had had enough. He became angry. But there is a strong connection to methamphetamine in this case, and we're going to discuss that now. Located within the residence at Grant was a bag of methamphetamine, 3 bags in fact. The total weight, as you can see, 6.18 grams. It was tested by the KBI, and they did detect the presence of methamphetamine. Also in the home, the paraphernalia used to ingest the drug methamphetamine. In these photos, you see paraphernalia that's commonly used to smoke it. And to inject it. You see quite a number of hypodermic needles here. We have no evidence or information that anyone in the home was diabetic, so we can only assume that these were all intended for the injection of methamphetamine. We have some more paraphernalia here, and also a scale. So at this point, when this case happened, I had been the DA for all of 68 days. We filed charges, 3 counts of premeditated first-degree murder against Joseph Cron. Here's the first page of the charging document, dated March 16, 2017. After a couple defense continuances, we had our first motion hearing in this case on May 5th. And at the conclusion of that hearing, we set a preliminary hearing date for July 11. On July 6th, the court, in this case, entered an order for a competency evaluation. The competency evaluation revealed the defendant, by his own admission, was using meth heavily in recent years. He shared that he had previously attempted suicide over 15 times, including one attempt involving a car crash that left him in a coma for 17 days. He stated that he started using meth after his wife had left him. The defendant was proud of his time in military service, and he had full VA benefits as a result. In the report, he questions how he could have killed 3 people, especially ones that he didn't even know. He stated that this act was in conflict with his value system and that he could not bring himself to comprehend it. He told the doctor he believed that he should not be in this world if the allegations were true. He claimed not to remember the murders themselves. And he does admit to using a lot of meth earlier that same day. Cron reported a history that includes hallucinations. The examining physician concluded that Cron was suffering from PTSD and severe amphetamine abuse. The report described Cron as a smart man who understood quite well the charges against him and the role that the parties play in court. The report concluded at the end of the examination that despite the PTSD, heavy meth use, and other medical history, that Cron was competent to understand the charges and able to help in his own defense. On July 10, 2017, a competency hearing was held. The court found Cron competent to stand trial. On August 30, a number of defense motions were heard and granted, 2 of them being denied. After the motion hearing, the parties engaged in meaningful plea discussions, really for the first time in that case. And those conversations revolved around our pending decision on whether or not to seek the death penalty. Ultimately, the parties reached an agreement. Joseph Cron would plead all 3 charges and agree to serve each sentence consecutively, 50 years for each of the victims he had killed. On October 20, 2017, Joseph Cron entered pleas to each of the 3 murder charges against him. I provided the factual basis to the court, largely relying on Cron's own confession. After inquiry, the court accepted the plea and adjudged the defendant guilty. Both parties agreed as a condition of the plea to jointly recommend a life sentence for each count. The parties would recommend that to the court to impose a hard 50 on each of the 3 counts pursuant to KSA 21-6623. Sentencing was held on November 11, 2017. Both parties recommended the sentence proposed in the plea agreement and asked the court to impose consecutive sentences. It was the objective of the parties that the defendant be sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences and not be eligible for parole prior to serving 150 years in prison. Each of the victims' families offered statements to the court. I'm going to read an excerpt from the Levitt family statement. Your Honor, we ask that you run the defendant's 3 life sentences consecutively to ensure he is unable to prey on anyone else. This is an unending pain in our hearts. Our world has been forever diminished by not having Matt's light in it. The defendant deserves so much worse than what the justice system allows, but the sentence should match the crimes. This is a life sentence for Matthew and for us. It should be for the defendant too. The defendant was offered allocution but declined to speak. The court imposed a sentence of 150 years. All right, let's talk some more about methamphetamine. It was, as I said, it played a central role in this case, both being in the home itself, but also specific to Mr. Cron. He admits using it. He admits to being a severe methamphetamine user, and we'll talk about why that's important. In fact, he admits to using it the day of. So if you have seen the show Breaking Bad, you may know a little bit about methamphetamine, but for everyone else, we're going to go through it real quick. So methamphetamine is a highly addictive stimulant. It's not uncommon for addiction to take hold upon a first use. It can be smoked, swallowed, snorted, or injected. The primary effects include an alertness, lack of fatigue, and euphoria. Side effects, however, include anxiety, confusion, irritability, restlessness, violent behavior, paranoia, and hallucinations. The high itself will last up to 6 hours. Originally discovered in 1893, it was actually used by Nazi Germany during World War II. They gave methamphetamine regularly to their soldiers as a way to increase energy and alertness. However, once the addictive effects were discovered, the Nazis stopped distributing the drug unless a soldier had a prescription. Let me say that again. The Nazis, Nazi Germany, stopped distributing methamphetamine because they were worried about the addictiveness. But they had an exception for someone that had a prescription. Because of energy levels and weight loss effects, methamphetamine was commonly prescribed for diets in the United States during the 50s and 60s. However, due to the harmful effects, it was classified as a Schedule II narcotic in the 1970s. Meth never really disappeared during this time, but it did take a backseat to other drugs in the 70s and 80s, such as marijuana, acid, PCP, cocaine, and crack. In the early 90s, the Nazi method, quote unquote Nazi method, for producing methamphetamine became very popular. People learned that by following a simple recipe, meth could be made as easily as baking a cake. A few prominent producers arose in the United States, and with the invention of the internet and the free dissemination of the meth recipe, meth labs popped up all over the country. Meth can be made by combining pseudoephedrine, methyl alcohol, ether, anhydrous ammonia, lithium metal, and rock salt. The process only took about 1 to 2 hours, and all of the ingredients at the time were available over the counter. Because it was synthetic and the ingredients were readily available, producers were not reliant on plants such as marijuana or poppies, so they were not affected by things like weather, drought, growth patterns, and so on. Also, the producers did not need to own vast quantities of land in order to cultivate their product. Here are some statistics provided by the DEA. They've been published annually in the National Drug Threat Assessment since 2002. If you look at the 2004-2005, you can see meth is a serious problem. In 2006, the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act was passed, and this made it incredibly difficult to obtain the precursors, which are a necessary ingredient that we've discussed to that recipe, that Nazi method recipe for producing methamphetamine. So if you look immediately after, the number of meth labs that we knew about dropped to 7,000 nationwide, and then in 2018, you can see that number dips again. So the labs have continued to disappear, but the amount of methamphetamine has actually increased exponentially. When you look in 2010, the number of seizures have increased by 87%, since 2010. And comparing 2009 to 2017, it's a pretty dramatic shift. 8% of all drug seizures in 2009 were methamphetamine, and 40% of all seizures in 2017 were methamphetamine. So meth production has left the United States for the most part. It's down in Mexico now, where they can make a much more pure product, and they can do it in mass quantities, and that's driving the price down. So what you have is vast quantities of meth readily available throughout the United States, and an inability to attack the actual production source, and the product itself being much more potent and a lot cheaper to obtain. In 2013, the price for a gram of methamphetamine was about $68. And in 2017, that dropped down to about $56. But right now in Topeka, the average cost of a gram of meth is about $20. And again, this is a very potent and highly addictive substance. Okay, let's talk about the drug grid. This is the Kansas sentencing drug grid. And if you look at the horizontal axis, you will see the range for a person's criminal history. The vertical axis is the severity of the crime. And where the two meet is the presumptive sentence. Everything in white on here is a presumptive prison sentence. Everything in blue is a border box. And the green obviously being probation. Possession of methamphetamine is a severity level 5 drug felony in the state of Kansas. Distribution or possession with intent to distribute is a severity level 1 through 4 drug felony. The level depends on the weight, as indicated in the chart on the bottom of this slide. So right now, we said $20 for a gram in Topeka. So how much is a gram? It's about the size of a sugar packet. And 1 gram can be cut into between 4 and 10 use amounts depending on the user. So I'm not going to do math on the fly, but 6-hour high, 4 to 10 times for $20, that's a lot of mileage for just $20. Let's go back to the grid for a minute. By law, if you possess 3.5 grams or more of methamphetamine, there is a presumption of intent to distribute. It's a rebuttable presumption, and I have seen that rebutted in court, but it's there. If a gun is carried during a drug crime, it does add 6 months to the sentence. If a gun is discharged during a drug crime, it adds 18 months to the sentence. Both enhancements also carry the presumption of prison. Here we have some statistics that are relevant to Shawnee County. We have seen a slight decrease in the yearly numbers if you look at 2015 and 2019, but overall we have seen the number of stimulant charges double over the last 8 years. And yes, there are other stimulants that are included within these numbers, like cocaine, for example, but methamphetamine makes up about 95% of our numbers here in Shawnee County. People talk about marijuana as being the gateway drug, and I suppose in a sense, it's often the first drug, street drug that is used by someone. But in terms of really driving crime and driving violent behavior, I would argue that methamphetamine is the true gateway drug. Once addicted, a meth user will continue using the drug. They may be charged one time with a felony possession charge, but that's going to bring additional charges down the road as they continue to possess and ingest methamphetamine. Generally speaking, in really almost every case that I'm aware of, a first-time user is going to receive probation. Even when convicted and sentenced on a felony, I would say even if presumptive prison, they're still going to receive probation and an opportunity for treatment. However, if they continue using, they may ultimately get that probation revoked, but typically they are afforded multiple opportunities to make better decisions and to get the treatment that they need. We'll talk more about treatment here in a minute. I want to pause for a second and talk about the devastating effects that this drug can have on not just, working class or somebody that's struggling with poverty, but it has the same effect on professionals as well. One of my first experiences with a meth case was a sentencing that was in front of Judge Wilson, Justice Wilson, when she was still Judge Wilson. And the defendant stood up and spoke to the court. And she described her story in that she was a registered nurse and she was very successful. She had a good job, she had family, friends, she had a beautiful home, and she had gone to a party with a friend of hers, and that friend had offered her methamphetamine. And she had never tried it before, never done any kind of drugs before, any kind of street drugs. And she tried it and she became addicted, and she let that drug take over her life. And in the span of a year, she had lost her family, her home, and her career. And at the time of the sentencing, she had gone through treatment and she was sober and she was determined to remain so. She was describing to the court trying to get a job as a CNA. She was a registered nurse. That was her education and experience level, but she was struggling to get a job as a CNA at this point after the havoc that the drug had caused on her personal and professional life. So meth addicts oftentimes lose their job, their source of income, and they have to turn to other crimes to finance that habit. So we see a lot of property crime, theft, burglary, robbery, and so on, even prostitution, in an attempt to feed the habit. And typically what we see is the addict will commit that property crime, sometimes starting with family members, sometimes starting with friends, sometimes a stranger, and they'll go to a pawn shop or they'll go to a place that does scrap metal and try and get enough money so they can go ahead and make that next purchase and have their next high ready to go. The overall effects of meth, it does affect behavior, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Generally speaking, I would say there's more domestic violence among meth users than the general population, violent behavior in general, and it does generate a fair amount of child in need of care cases. So let's talk about treatment. Bottom line, we don't really have a magic pill to deal with methamphetamine. The only effective treatment that's recognized right now for that addiction is cognitive treatment. So retraining the brain to not seek the rewards that the drug will bring. That type of treatment cannot occur by reporting to a probation officer one time a week. That's just not going to cut it. And there is a push right now to decriminalize drug addiction nationally. And we've had some of those conversations here locally too. But that really can't happen when you're talking about methamphetamine until we have implemented effective treatment options. And it's unfortunate, but as we'll see, meth does drive violent behavior. And oftentimes people who are suffering from meth addiction will engage in violent behavior. So they're not just hurting themselves anymore, they're hurting other people. Ultimately, incarceration is not an ideal solution. It's not the best solution. Yes, you heard me say that right, for a meth addict. And it's ultimately not a solution that's going to be able to sustain itself. What we need is local, secure treatment facilities where effective cognitive treatment can be administered through a forced inpatient approach. And then the criminal justice system can monitor aftercare through our courts. And if we do it that way, we can keep people out of jail and or prison for being meth addicts. While the violence that occurred in the Grant Street triple homicide is pretty horrible, an equally shocking part of this story that is sometimes overlooked is that there were young children living in that home when these crimes actually occurred. They weren't there the night of the homicide, but that was their home. They just happened to be gone that night. They were living in those conditions, surrounded by meth addicts. This is the environment that many of our youth face on a daily basis. Addressing the methamphetamine problem is not only necessary for the current state of our community, it is necessary for those children that are being raised in that type of environment. So again, we have a need for secure regional treatment centers. And really, you can't address this issue in 28 to 30 days. That's great for a detox, that's great for inpatient therapy, but we're also going to need a structure in place for after they leave inpatient. So transitional housing or outpatient housing, so they don't go immediately back into the environment that created this cycle for them. Long-term counseling, and it's my hope that in the coming years we can develop some of these systems and some of these resources can be brought to bear to better address this issue. We do have a drug court in Shawnee County, which is very fortunate, and it's really working quite well. The way drug court works today is a little bit different than the way it used to, and I'll talk about that. The old rendition of drug court was a pre-conviction, essentially a diversion program that the court oversaw, and I appeared. I was assigned to drug court when I was a frontline prosecutor, so I'm very familiar with how that system worked. And when I took over, one of the conversations I had with Judge Brown, who was the judge running drug court then, was how can we expand the eligibility of people, not just into drug court, but if we're looking at issues like mental health and drug addiction as oftentimes co-occurring, and sometimes it's impossible to differentiate those two. What about a more holistic approach that kind of addresses both problems at the same time, and also broadening the spectrum of eligibility to include people that maybe have already been convicted or wouldn't normally qualify for a diversion, so they're not going to get a diversion through my office, but they can still participate in drug court. We had those conversations. Ultimately, Judge Brown retired and Judge Osman came in, and those conversations continued. And we did some studies on national best practices, and we came up with a policy proposal for the court to consider. Ultimately, the court decided to adopt the model that is in place now, and it's working very well. And I'm very pleased with how it's working. But the drug court model now takes someone who is presumptive prison, but they have a methamphetamine addiction. Usually they're charged with possession, or it's clear that that's the underlying issue, and they receive an opportunity, kind of a final chance, theoretically, to participate in the 12-month drug court program with regular supervision and check-ins with the court, and a lot of treatment and support built to make them successful. So let's talk about the link between methamphetamine and violence. This is from Methamphetamine Psychosis, the Epidemiology and Management. They conclude that psychotic symptoms and syndromes are frequently experienced among individuals who use methamphetamine, with recent estimates of up to 40% of users affected. So 4 out of 10 are going to have psychotic symptoms. Acute symptoms include agitation and violence, delusions, and I thought this was interesting, may require inpatient psychiatric or other crisis intervention setting. So again, going back to the idea of a secured inpatient treatment facility to allow for detox to occur and allow for that initial inpatient treatment to take hold. Psychosis can recur and persist, making it difficult to distinguish from a primary psychotic disorder such as schizophrenia. So again, Mr. Cron is using methamphetamine, he's having hallucinations. Do we really know whether he is a severe meth addict, or is he a paranoid schizophrenic, or is he both? Sometimes it's impossible to tell when so much methamphetamine is being used. This was an interesting study in Los Angeles County. The researchers interviewed respondents who reported specific acts of violence while they were under the influence of methamphetamine. They broke it down in categories. So as you can see, 51% involved acts of violence in domestic relationships. 28% involved violent acts that were specifically drug related, so fighting over the drugs, drug trafficking, things of that nature. 8.6 were specifically gang related, and 11.3% involved random acts of violence, to include an attack on a stranger or road rage, something along those lines. And this is from methamphetamine use and violence. This one is probably the most relevant to this discussion. A national case control study conducted by Paul Strateski of the Department of Sociology Center for the Study of Crime and Justice at Colorado State. And he combined data from the National Household Survey on Drug Abuse and the Survey of Inmates in state and federal correctional facilities. And the results suggest that the odds of committing a homicide are nearly 9 times greater for an individual who uses methamphetamine. 9 times. And perhaps even more significantly, that number remains true even after adjusting for alternative drug use, sex, race, income, marital status, age, previous arrests, military experience, and education level. Simply put, methamphetamine does not care who you are. It will affect you the same way. But wait, we are attorneys. We already know that meth is dangerous, right? In the matter of James Fuller, who is an attorney admitted to practice in our state, he began taking Adderall while he was in law school, and then he began purchasing it illegally after he graduated from law school. He started using methamphetamine when that wasn't good enough, and also marijuana. He began missing his court dates and missing out on his other obligations. Ultimately, he started trading his legal services for drugs. I don't recommend that. Fuller eventually reported his actions. His law firm also filed a complaint. In October of 2019, the Supreme Court suspended his license for failure to comply with the annual attorney registration requirements. After that, he engaged in the unauthorized practice of law. Again, I don't recommend that. The hearing panel is unanimously recommending an indefinite suspension, and the disciplinary administrator's office is also making that recommendation. Mr. Fuller is seeking a 6-month suspension, and if you are interested to see what happens in this matter, it will be heard by the Supreme Court on Monday at 11 a.m.
Mike, would now be a good time to do the polling question?
Sure.
All right, we'll go ahead and do that real quick. So I've launched the polling question. As you can tell, it doesn't really quite fit along with our topic, but the question is, the first NFL game of the season was played last night in Kansas City. Who won that game? And this is just for participation. The correct answer does not have to be made. Any answer is correct. And if you're having trouble answering, just send me an email. Actually, no one's having trouble answering. Everybody has voted. I'm going to end the poll. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amanda. Okay, and that really concludes the presentation. And I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you have 5, but we can go on longer if
Oh,
need.
okay.
So, yeah.
5 minutes. Gotcha.
But we can go on longer if anyone has more questions. There's several ways to ask questions. You can raise your hand and I will unmute you. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A. You can type your question in there or in the chat box, wherever you prefer, and we will see it. Mike, we have our first question. Will Uh, hold on. Let me get it open. It's not opening. Okay, I have it open now. Will Kansas court case be available live online? Supreme Court case be available live online?
Yes, I believe so. In fact, I believe that for the first time, starting on Monday, the Supreme Court will be using Zoom for their hearing. So I do think it will be available to watch live. That's my understanding.
All right, next we have, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. Now, drug court is for people who have been convicted. It no longer is a diversion program. If that's the case, then our first time people given a chance at diversion.
Yeah, excellent question. And I'm sorry, I should have clarified that. So it is a post-conviction only. That is the model that the court chose. However, we do a significant number of diversions in our office. In fact, when looking at the numbers, we do more felony diversions in Shawnee County than any other prosecution office in the state. And a fair number of those are for drug users for possession charges. So it's not a drug court, but it's a drug diversion, and we do those, and we connect that person who's struggling with their addiction problem with the local treatment resource and make sure that they successfully complete that. And we've had really good success rates with our diversion program. At last look, we were about 97% success in terms of being able to complete the diversion. Yeah, good question.
All right, we do have someone who's raised their hand. So Kyle Mead, I'm going to allow you to talk.
Thank you. Great presentation, Mike. Thanks. Over at Lawyer's Title, I am able to do a quick search in the background on this particular property and discovered that it was a former foreclosure and likely a rental at the time that all of this had happened. Is there any thought or any steps about working with the landlord association or that sort of thing with, I mean, I don't know if there would be any liability for the property owner in these cases or that sort of thing. I'm just kind of curious as to whether those avenues for prevention are being considered or acted on right now.
Right. Great question. Thank you. So specific to the landlord association, there has not been a conversation there, but there is a civil proceeding for declaring a structure to be a nuisance, and it's tied to public safety in our office in terms of criminal activity. And what we see generally is drug houses, and sometimes a motel could be used for that too, and prostitution and things like that. And if we're able to identify those patterns and document everything appropriately, there is a civil action that we can pursue from the DA's office, and that is something that I intend to focus on really starting towards the end of this year. It's really been a capacity issue for us, not having enough staff on hand to take on something new like that. But it is on the books, and it's something that as you said, I think we should be doing, we should be looking at. So you can expect to see those sort of actions probably starting here within the next couple of months.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
So I have two questions that are pretty closely related. So I'm going to kind of read them both. When you handle a child in need of care cases, about what percentage of the cases were related to meth? And then the second question was, do you have the statistics on meth and sink cases?
That is a tremendous question. I wish I had those numbers in front of me. I would defer to the head of my sync unit, the very talented Morgan Hall. I'm sure she could give me that information. Amanda, who asked that question? I can follow up with them.
Yeah, so we had Randy Debenham and Renee Netherton both answered those questions or asked those questions.
Okay, so for Randy and Renee, let me talk to Morgan, or you could talk to Morgan too, and I can get that information for you. Anecdotally, I can tell you when I started in the DA's office, I was doing sync cases, and methamphetamine was a concern in at least half of them.
All right, so the next question is who reported the crimes and what was their involvement?
Right. So we had a couple reporters of the crime, the young man and the woman who walked in to the law enforcement center. However, we do have other cases that have gone through the court system already involving co-defendants in this case. I chose to focus on Mr. Cron because that was one I handled personally, and because he doesn't have any pending litigation at any level. And so I was comfortable doing that. So I'm not going to name names, but the young man and the young woman who walked into the law enforcement center were the ones who made the initial reports.
All right, do we have any more questions at this time? Please feel free to type them in or raise your hand either way, and I will get to them. And as always, I think most everyone on this does know how to contact Mr. Kege, so you can always reach out to him if you don't want to ask, if you have a question and you don't want to ask it on the webinar or in person. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that, Amanda. If anyone does have a question for me, you want to talk about these issues, you want to talk about the case, the presentation, whatever, I'm available. I should have included my number on here. I apologize, but I'll give you my email verbally. It's pretty easy to remember. It's mike.kege@snco.us. If anyone has any follow-up questions.
All right, it looks like we have silent, and that is perfect timing. We are just 2 minutes over our normal time. So thank you so much, Mike, for presenting and this very interesting topic and good timing. And thank you everyone for attending. Do not hesitate to reach out to him for questions. And also there was an eval in the evaluation in the last email I sent out to you this morning. Please take the time to fill that out and send it to me. We love feedback and love to hear ideas for upcoming presentations. And I thank you very much for attending.
Yes, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.